Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get going. So we have basically two lecture modules left for content that's going to be on exam 3. And the first of these 2 lecture packages will be on receptor theories, divided into 1 and 2. And then we're also going to, starting on Friday and then next Monday, getting into dose response considerations. Let me shut the door here. And we'll dim the lights in the front so you can see better. Hopefully. There we go. Yeah, so these next 4 lectures are really going to be about kind of the theory of pharmacology. And this one these 2 have to do with just the behavior of how drugs work in relationship to receptors. And it's kind of logical in content, has some strengths and some weaknesses that I'll point out. So let's just jump right into this. So a little bit of background. You've seen this before, but I want to remind you that receptors are by far the most common drug target. And receptors come in different varieties. We have G protein coupled receptors. There are a lot of drugs against these. Also receptors that are tyrosine kinases. Oftentimes these are growth factor receptors. And then a lot of nuclear receptors. And remember, these are the weird ones because they don't exist on the cell surface. Rather, the ligand or the drug has to diffuse through the membrane and then encounter the receptor in the cytoplasm or in some cases even in the nucleus. And these ones can actually, certain types of nuclear receptors can shuttle from the cytoplasm into the nucleus, and others are obligately nuclear. And then we have a few weird ones that are kind of like receptors. They're basically channels that also have some receptor-like properties. But at any rate, you have a lot of receptors, and the question today is, how can we think about receptors and drugs interacting in the body? I want to mention now, if you look downstream from the receptors, when a ligand or a drug binds the receptor, something has to happen. So the real question is, what happens after the ligand binds? G protein coupled receptors activate G proteins, and then they make second messengers, and these things like cyclic AMP, and these activate something that the cell responds to. And so downstream from each of these receptors, a lot of stuff happens. And that whole area, it's a scientific area, what happens at receptors and then points downstream from that inside the cell, that's the field of signal transduction. And we'll get into that in some more detail for the last section of this course. But in order to understand today, I want to mention it briefly. So signal transduction is basically the following. You have ligands or drugs, kind of floating around in the extracellular space. They encounter a receptor. We know a little bit about that now. We've learned about affinity, dissociation constants, and so forth. But hopefully that ligand-target interaction elicits some kind of a response in the cell. And so signal transduction is largely concerned with what happens once a ligand or drug binds to a receptor. And so basically, ligand-receptor interactions couple this interaction to cellular responses. They are involved in transmitting and transducing that response. That's why we call it signal transduction, because the original signal is the ligand binding to a receptor, but that interaction transduces some more signaling that happens, for the most part, internally in the cell. And what ultimately happens are usually one of 2 things. In some cases, the receptor ligand binding triggers an immediate cellular response, something like opening a channel so that things can go back and forth between the cell and the exterior of the cell. But in some cases, that signaling pathway leads to the nucleus, and you turn on genes by making messenger RNA. So it includes activating transcription factors, for instance. And so one ligand can actually activate 50 or 100 or 200 or 300 transcription factors, and you get all of these genetic responses. So some pathways, signal transduction pathways, also involve something called second messengers. And to understand why we call them second messengers, I want to back up a bit and talk about the first messenger. So the first messenger is really the ligand, or the drug. It is binding to the receptor, and so it's acting like a messenger because it's, to use the analogy, it's transporting a signal that's going to be relayed somewhere, like a messenger would. So the first messenger is the ligand binding the target. A second messenger is some intracellular compound that is generated because of that, in response to that receptor ligand targeting. And it could be small molecule, could be intracellular ions, a lot of different things. Okay. And so that's why second messengers are called second messengers, because the first messenger is actually the ligand. So receptors actually perform three identifiable things that we can think of as features. Receptors can act as a transducer, and remember, signal transduction, the root word there is transduce in transduction. So receptors act as transducers because they can pass a signal along, but often they change it into a new form. It's kind of like you get an email and you have some information, and then you convey it to another person in the form of a text message, right? You've taken information and turned it from one form into another. That's sort of analogous to what's going on here. Receptors also act as discriminators. They're selective, right? So a given receptor will bind maybe 1 or 2 or 3 different ligands, but not 10,000 ligands. So they're discriminating between different ligands because of affinities. So it acts like a discriminator as well, a chooser. Receptors also can act as amplifiers. So you have a tiny amount of ligand, it binds to a receptor, but then that receptor can continue to transmit the signal and kind of amplify it over time. Okay. So if you think about this, there's kind of a core principle that emerges from this. So the idea is that the magnitude, the strength of the body's response to a drug is going to be related to the magnitude of the drug receptor interaction. And how big of how vast or expansive is that interaction? It's going to be related somehow to the dose you administer of the drug. So the idea is if you give a little drug, you'll get a little bit of response. If you give a lot of the drug, presumably you might get more response. Okay? And so this whole area of thought called receptor theories has developed to kind of describe these in some more detail. So let's get into receptor theories. And they aren't too complex, but we can start to think about this in different terms. So once again, the core principle is the effect is going to be proportional to the receptor interactions in some way, right? And so, if we think about it just kind of like a little simple equation-like thing, here we have a ligand unbound to a receptor. So we have a ligand and a receptor, but they've not gotten together yet. These can get together, though, and form a ligand-receptor complex. And then presumably, then signal transduction happens, this arrow, but eventually you get some kind of an effect. So you aren't going to get that effect unless the ligand associates with the receptor. When the ligand associates with the receptor, then some sort of a biological effect occurs. And there are basically 2 different sets of receptor theories that have come about that describe this, and they're called the occupancy theory and the rate theory. So the occupancy theory basically has to do with the number of receptor interactions with ligand, And the rate theory has to do with the frequency of these receptor interactions, how long they last. So, if you think about, I want to mention, first of all, that you have, let's take the estrogen receptor, for example. You have some cell that's expressing the estrogen receptor, one of the estrogen receptors. Well, in reality, each cell probably has thousands of copies of the estrogen receptor on its cell surface, right? It's not just like there's one receptor on one cell. Each cell has thousands of copies of each receptor type. And those receptors are spread among different cells in the body. So occupancy theory then comes into play, and it's the number of receptor interactions that are important. Are 50% of the receptors occupied by ligand? 25%? Are all of the receptors occupied by the ligand? And occupancy theory would state that the greater the percentage of occupancy of the receptors, the greater the response. Another way to look at this is rate theory, and this is the frequency of receptor interactions. So if you have a high affinity interaction between a ligand and a receptor, then most of the time that receptor is going to be bound with the ligand. If you have low affinity, then that ligand can easily dissociate, fall off, right? And you'll have less proportion of time that receptor is occupied. And so these are two different ways to think about the problem, but in reality, both are probably happening at the same time. But to think about this, we can take them one at a time. Does that make sense, you guys? Okay. So let's first talk about occupancy theory. And here we're talking about the number of receptor interactions, the proportion of receptors that are bound by ligand. So if you think about it, the maximal effect that you can ever possibly get is when all of the receptors have been bound and then activated by a ligand. Even though each cell has perhaps thousands of each type of receptor on its surface, and some cells, and each cell type will have a different set of receptors that are expressed in that cell, you can't get more than complete saturation, right? Maximal receptor binding is 100%. It's impossible to get 110%, right? Because you reach a limit when all the receptors are occupied. And we would call that saturation. The receptors are saturated with the drug. And once again, as more ligand interacts with the target, the magnitude of the cellular effect will presumably be greater. So let's look at that in an experiment. And here we have on the x-axis increasing amount of drug. We can think of it as increasing concentration of drug if you want, going from left to right. And on the y-axis here, we have the biological response. So maybe this is a drug that's supposed to increase heart rate. Once you add as much drug as possible, you can't increase beyond a certain point because the receptors get occupied. And it looks something like this. When there is no ligand or drug, there is no drug-induced response, right? But then as you add more and more drug, the response goes up and up until it reaches a maximal value. And typically out here in this region that I'm indicating, that's when all the receptors are occupied, okay? And so this is increases in concentration on a linear axis here, and response is linear as well. We can actually convert this graph into a semi-log presentation, and that means that we've converted all the concentrations into the log of the concentrations on the x-axis. But the y-axis is not transformed. That's just plain old numbers, okay? So this is the same data where we're on the x-axis. Now we're indicating the log of the concentration. Why do people do this? This data here is no different than this data. All we've really done is transform these by taking the log of the concentrations. What it does, though, is it turns this N-shaped curve into a sigmoidal curve. So in a lot of pharmacology, you'll oftentimes see log transformations on the x-axis, and this shows you kind of what happens. One of the reasons that's nice is that it kind of spreads out the interesting part of the graph, and now you can easily see how increases in drug change the response, okay? So there is an interesting number we can figure out here, which is called the EC50, the effective concentration 50. And this is simply the concentration of drug, the dose, at which you get a half maximal response. So at this particular concentration here, the response is half of its maximal amount. And that's a great number if you can get that, because the EC50 of the drug tells you a lot about, you know, what dosages are reasonable, okay? You're getting some effect, but it's half the amount that you can get. If I had something out here toward the right, say where the cursor is right now, what happens at this dosage and I add a little bit more? Nothing further happens, right? So all you're doing is adding more drug for no reason. Maybe that gives you a risk of more side effects. And so in general, we want to dose things so we're getting a decent response. But you hit this point where saturation starts to occur, and then the only thing you're doing by increasing the dosage is basically increasing risk. So that's why this is important. But that's all occupancy theory. And so we can develop some very simple equations here. So here we have what's going on. And let's think about dissociation constants again. So remember, here is a ligand bound to a receptor, and that can dissociate into free ligand and free receptor. So this is kind of review from before, but basically the dissociation constant, Kd, is going to be the concentration of free ligand times the concentration of free receptor divided by the concentration of the ligand receptor complex, okay? So that's the dissociation constant. But now we can kind of modify this equation just very subtly and come up with a term called fractional occupancy. And so fractional occupancy is kind of a rearrangement of this dissociation constant, very similar. But think about that. It's the concentration of ligand receptor complex divided by the concentration of free ligand plus the concentration of the ligand receptor complex. So one way to look at the denominator of this is the following. Here is free receptor. Here is receptor bound to ligand. If you add those two numbers up, that's the total amount of receptors, right? It's just that some are bound with ligand and some are unbound. This is unbound, this is bound. So the denominator is the total amount of receptors. The numerator is the number of receptors that bind ligand. So if you look at that simple equation, it's just telling you basically the fractional occupancy, what fraction of occupancy you have at that particular receptor. And that can vary between 0 and 1. If you multiply it by 100, it'd be 0% to 100%, right? Make sense? Okay, so that's kind of occupancy theory, just summarized, and it makes a lot of sense. The more drug you add, the more occupancy you have, the more effect you have. You can develop this EC50 statistic, and after receptors are completely occupied by ligand, additional drug isn't going to do anything else. It's saturated. That's great. And you know what? Occupancy theory is really great for agonists. Just receptors that are sitting around with no ligand at all. You start adding a drug that binds them, and certainly the more receptor is occupied by an agonist, the more activation you'll have. But occupancy theory has some difficulties when you talk about antagonists, especially competitive antagonists, which we've already talked about a little bit, because there you have two different things competing for a receptor, okay? And so it gets a little bit more complex. Another problem in reality with occupancy theory is drug fade or habituation. That's where, you have a good dose that's working for a while, and then like 2 months later, it's not working as well. So the effect is fading. Or, it's almost like the same way of saying that the patient is becoming habituated to the drug. What do you think could cause something like that? Well, maybe there's some feedback regulation going on in the system. So, maybe the amount of receptors is actually changing in the patient over time because of the drug administration due to some complexities, stuff like that. So, the rate of, if you think of excitation as activation, another interesting thing that rate theory accounts for a little bit better is that the rate of on and off becomes very important. So really we're talking about the rate of association and dissociation. And so here we're talking more about kind of the kinetics of receptor or ligand binding and release, as opposed to just looking at it simply as if how many are occupied and how many are not. In reality, there's always association and dissociation going on. So rate theory is a little bit better with that. So mostly we think about occupancy theory, but I do want to mention rate theory because it's kind of a little bit more sophisticated, and you can start to bring in antagonists. But I would say occupancy theory is kind of the more predominant one. So now let's go ahead and look at some more of this with some more sophisticated thinking, I guess. And first we'll consider agonists. So once again, an agonist is a ligand that binds a receptor, or a drug that binds, I should say a drug in this case. An agonist is a drug that binds a receptor, and it stimulates a response. So you get a positive response because the drug binds to the receptor. Whereas an antagonist is a drug or a ligand that binds the receptor and prevents the response. And oftentimes it's preventing response to an endogenous ligand or an endogenous agonist. So, direct agonism is a drug that binds, in this case it's binding to a channel that has a acceptor site for a drug. And when that drug binds, that channel opens. Sometimes though you can find drugs that bind and close the channel. And antagonists can be competitive or they can be non-competitive. Sometimes you can get antagonists that are just non-competitive like this. There's nothing else going on except when this drug binds, that channel gets closed. But sometimes you get competitive. So if we think about it, we can start to compare different drugs that bind the same receptor, and we can further divide agonists into full and partial agonists. So a full agonist, when it binds a receptor, it yields a large stimulus, a large set of downstream signal transduction signaling, and you get a large effect. A partial agonist is a different entity, a different chemical entity, but when a partial agonist binds the same receptor, you get a smaller stimulation of signaling and a smaller effect. So it just doesn't work quite as well. And there are a lot of examples of drug classes where you have full agonists and then other drugs that are partial agonists. Which one's better? It depends on the disease state. Sometimes a partial agonist is a more gentle drug and it's better, So maybe this drug, even though it's a partial agonist, is less toxic than the full agonist drug and it might be a better choice. Or maybe this is the best drug because it just works better. It's kind of a case-by-case thing to decide which one's better. But this illustrates the difference between a full agonist and a partial agonist. So these partial agonists are kind of interesting. You know, one thing I would say, you know, agonists can activate receptors kind of along a continuum of effectiveness. And so one drug might differ from another. You still have this occupancy theory stuff going on at the same time. The more drug you add, the bigger the response. But in general, partial agonists elicit a submaximal response as compared to the full agonist, even when fully occupying the receptor population. So that's a real difference there. So the maximal response of a full agonist when saturation is reached is going to be greater than the maximal response of a partial agonist, because it doesn't work well. So even if you fully saturate all the receptors with a partial agonist, the response will never be as high as with the full agonist. Okay? What does that look like? Here's an example. So here we're looking at Emax, the maximal efficacy of two different drugs, drug A and drug B. And drug A, as you increase the dosage or the concentration of the drug, it builds up to this level. But drug B, you can increase until it will increase no more, a different saturation, and the maximal response is only like 45 or something. So which one do you think is the full agonist versus, if this is drug A up here and this is drug B down here, which one's the partial agonist? Drug B, right? I see people nodding their heads when I say drug B. Yep, so that's the curve of a partial agonist, the lower curve compared to a full agonist up here. They have different Emaxes. So we talked about, this is Emax's maximal efficacy, okay? So if we think about efficacy, we can call that, the intrinsic activity is another name for this, but it's oftentimes denoted by alpha, a symbol for efficacy. So the efficacy of a full agonist is 1, and the efficacy of a partial agonist is somewhere between 0 and 1, okay? And Emax is the maximal efficacy, and it usually reaches this plateau because of saturation. So Emax is specific to the drug, isn't it? It's not specific to the biological system, it's specific to the particular drug. And so here are two different drugs, A and B, that are affecting the same thing. It's just that A causes Emax to be way up here, and B, the partial agonist, has a lesser effect. So the Emax of A is different than the Emax of B. Another way of saying this is the partial agonist has an Emax that is lower than a full agonist Emax. Okay. So that's just two different receptors with different partial and full agonists. But there are a couple of other types of agonists we want to mention as well. Okay. Indirect agonists and inverse agonists. So an indirect agonist is interesting. It's a ligand that binds to a different site than where the endogenous ligand would bind. And so if you have such a situation, we call it an indirect agonist in an allosteric site. So here is an example of a channel that has receptor-like qualities, but when a neurotransmitter binds here, it opens up. But here is a drug that binds at a completely different site on the protein, and when it binds, it also causes the channel to open. So this is indirect agonism because the binding site of the drug is different than the binding site of the neurotransmitter. And we call that an allosteric site, okay? One of the interesting things about this drug is that when this drug binds, it does not interfere with the ability of the endogenous ligand to bind somewhere else, in this case a neurotransmitter. So these are interesting drugs because they can perform some agonism, but you're not going to completely disable that receptor or channel, whatever the target is, because the endogenous ligand can bind somewhere else. And sometimes that's very favorable because you're not just disabling a biological pathway when using these indirect agonists. Now, an inverse agonist is similar to an indirect agonist because it also binds at an allosteric site. But in this case, you have the opposite effect. It does the opposite of an agonist, basically. So here you have a real kind of push-pull situation. The inverse agonist is, when it binds the drug here, it has a negative response, whereas the neurotransmitter, the endogenous ligand, is trying to activate. And so inverse agonists are really weird. It's true, they're kind of the opposite of an agonist, but they're different than an antagonist because they're binding at this allosteric site. And that's the distinction. So inverse agonists also can work in, if you think about it in terms of structural chemistry, they can bind to active receptors, sometimes constitutively active receptors. These are receptors that are just basically always on. But basically, if you think about any allostery, and here we're using inverse agonists as an example, what happens is when the inverse agonist binds, it's going to change the structure of the receptor itself so that it might have a different affinity for the endogenous ligand, okay? And so a lot of these allosteric site drugs, they bind somewhere else than where a normal ligand binds, but they change the shape of the receptor such that the affinity for the endogenous ligand changes. And that's an interesting thing. So here's a little diagram. The top one is how an agonist works ordinarily. You have an inactive receptor. It binds a ligand, and then something happens downstream. In this case, you're recruiting the activity of a G protein. But an inverse agonist can actually alter the structure of the receptor, and if it's extreme, it can actually inactivate it. Okay. So inverse agonists are weird. So I showed you kind of full and partial agonists. Inverse agonists are the one case where efficacy alpha is less than 0. And so here is drug A, a regular agonist, looking at increasing concentrations of the drug and effects on efficacy. The bottom one, drug C, as you add more drug, it actually goes below 0. It's doing the opposite of an agonist. And so this is the typical response of an inverse agonist. Now, if there were a partial agonist, it would be somewhere in between 0 and 100, okay? So that's kind of the way you can see the behavior of an inverse agonist. It's the only case where you actually get a negative efficacy. Okay. Let's move on now to antagonists. So inverse agonists are really kind of weird. There aren't that many drugs like that, but I want to, for sake of completeness, show you these. So what do we have? We have agonists, partial agonists, inverse agonists. But let's talk about antagonists now. So once again, an agonist is a ligand that binds the receptor and stimulates a response. An antagonist is something that binds the receptor and prevents an agonist response. So in this case, there's some sort of competition going on. So you can have very strong antagonists that just act like blockers, okay? So these bind directly to the receptor and typically at the same site where a normal endogenous ligand would bind. So here is this antagonist. We could also call it a competitive inhibitor. And here's the site on the protein. Let's say it's a receptor. And when this inhibitor, this antagonist, binds that site, it occupies it, and it prevents the binding of an endogenous ligand. It's kind of like if you're flying in the airport and you're coming into a gate, but unfortunately there's another plane at the gate you're going to use, right? And so that's the action of a very potent antagonist. And you know, sometimes we call these blockers, like beta blockers. It's just, it's a really strong antagonist. But you know, this is a nice little diagram. Remember, if this inhibitor, this competitive inhibitor, this antagonist, if it wasn't present, the ligand could bind, correct? So what's really going on in a real human is that there's competition for this site between the antagonist and the endogenous ligand, and who wins out is going to be determined by the affinity of the endogenous ligand for the receptor as compared to the affinity of the antagonist for the receptor. So if the antagonist has a higher affinity for that receptor, then that's going to be a pretty good antagonist. And if it's so much higher that almost 100% of the time this is happening, then we would call it a blocker, basically. But it's all mediated by the relative affinities of the endogenous ligand and the antagonist for a particular binding site. So that brings us to competitive antagonism. And here we can look at the effect, again, based on concentrations, and you'll see something interesting here. So this is the same type of graph as before. Antagonism on one axis and the effect on the other. I can tell this is actually a log scale here because these are sigmoidal S-shaped curves. Indeed, you can see it goes like 0.1, 1, 10, 100. So that's log transform. But it allows us to more easily see what's going on. And what we have here is two situations. The red line here is the effect curve of just an agonist alone. And as you can see, as you add more, you reach a EC50 and then an Emax. But the blue curve is the same system. You still have that same agonist as an A, but now you've started to add in increasing concentrations of a competitive antagonist. And you'll see that the whole thing is shifted to the right. You can still reach the same Emax, but it takes a lot more of A. So, you know, this could also be, this could be an endogenous ligand, this is a drug, or we could be comparing two different drugs where you're adding two drugs at the same time. But competitive antagonism shifts everything to the right. And so that's a real difference with, for instance, agonists and partial agonists. Partial agonists causes Emax to go down. Competition with a competitive antagonist shifts things to the right, but they can still reach 100. Okay? But basically this makes sense because, if you have ligand 1 that has this curve, and then you throw in an antagonist that when it occupies a receptor, it's going to prevent that receptor from activating, and it's also going to prevent A from binding. It will shift the whole curve to the right. Okay. And so here it is all kind of together, showing these two different cases. And again, this is a competition. But actually in this one, we're talking about competitive antagonism and irreversible antagonism, which is a bit different. So here is what we just talked about, an agonist alone, and here's an agonist plus a competitive antagonist, and it shifts everything to the right. But in case B, here's the same agonist alone, but we've added a different drug. This is an irreversible antagonist, okay? It does something weird. It causes an actual reduction in the maximal effect when you add an irreversible antagonist. So what would make an irreversible antagonist? How about if you had a drug that could never dissociate from the receptor site? Physically impossible to dissociate from the receptor site. How would you do that? Well, there are a few drugs that actually bind to a receptor and then make a covalent link. So they make an adduct. And so if you have a drug that binds to a receptor and then it forms a chemical bond with the receptor, not a wimpy little hydrogen bond like a carbon-carbon bond or something like that, then that receptor is permanently disabled. It's taken out of action. And that's what these irreversible antagonists can do. So every time a receptor encounters an irreversible antagonist, that receptor is kicked out of the swimming pool. It's not going to do anything from there on out, okay? And there are a few drugs that are like that. They can be dangerous drugs because usually if you have an unwanted effect coming from a drug, what does the doctor say? They say, stop taking the drug, right? Or reduce the dosage. If you've administered an irreversible antagonist drug, though, there's no undoing it. Those receptors are permanently destroyed. And the only thing you can do is wait for new receptors to be produced, and that could take a long time. But it's an effective drug. Okay, so that kind of brings us to what we call non-competitive antagonist. And this gets a little bit different, but basically I won't go through all of this, but non-competitive antagonists are very similar, if not identical, to these irreversible antagonists. I think we can use them interchangeably because here is the curve for this non-competitive antagonist. If you think about it, any irreversible antagonist has to be non-competitive, right? Because if you permanently disable the receptor because some drug is physically cross-linked to it, then there's no way to. It's not a situation of competition anymore. You've effectively just reduced the number of receptors available because you've destroyed some of them. So you can read through that, and there's some examples of these in here. But the danger is for these, they can't be undone. I do want to mention also physiological antagonism. This is quite different, and that's because of the complexity of our cells. Oops, dropped my mic here. I've dropped the mic, but I'm not leaving, okay? This is not like a drop the mic thing. Let's see. There we go. So here, think of an example. Let's take alcohol and coffee, okay? Coffee and alcohol work by two different mechanisms. Is this thing, yes, thing's still working? I think so. But, if you think of alcohol as somewhat of a sedative and coffee as something of a stimulant, presumably, if you added them both at the same time, each one might kind of counteract the other to some extent. Another example could be like an opiate and a stimulant, that kind of a thing. And the reason is that you have situations where one receptor causes, for instance, sedation, and a different receptor causes stimulation. So if you activate the receptor that causes sedation, and you also activate a different system that causes stimulation, then the sedation and stimulation might kind of balance out. And it looks like antagonism, doesn't it? Except they're completely different receptors, completely different systems. It could be completely different organs. And you get this kind of biological antagonism, okay? And that's why that happens. So I want to mention that. It looks like classic competitive antagonism, but it's not, because it's biological. There's an example here of blood vessel dilation, there are sympathetic nerves and parasympathetic nerves that can all affect dilation of blood vessels, but you have different drugs that can, and different ligands that can affect both of those. Okay. So last few minutes, I just want to get into something briefly, but this is actually very important. The distinction between affinity and efficacy. So affinity is the ability of a ligand to bind to a receptor. So that is a receptor-ligand interaction, a bimolecular interaction. But efficacy is the relationship between receptor occupancy and some biological response, okay? So affinity has to do with like dissociation constants, a ligand and a target getting together, but efficacy is some response. Could be blood pressure, it could be vasodilation of blood vessels. And these are two different things, but sometimes people will get them confused. So I now want to introduce this in a slightly different way, talking about potency versus efficacy. And this is just key for your understanding. You really must know this. So here is log of drug concentration versus response. And we have two different drugs. This drug has half maximal response at a lower concentration than drug Y. So we would say that drug X is more potent than drug Y because a lower dosage of drug X, a lower concentration of drug X, gives you the same level of response as a higher concentration of this drug Y. So drug X is more potent than drug Y. And the reason for this is that drug X has a higher affinity for its target than drug Y. That's comparing potencies, okay? Now, both of these drugs get you up to a level of 100. It's just that you have to add more of drug Y to get there than in drug X, right? Drug Y might be the preferred one. Maybe this one costs, maybe drug Y, even though it's less potent, costs $5 a pill, and this one costs $5,000 a pill, but they both do the same thing, and they have no toxicity. Drug Y is great for the patient because he only pays $5, right? Now here's a different case. Again, we're comparing two drugs, different two drugs. In this case, as you increase the concentration of drug X, you get up near 100. And as you increase the concentration of drug Y, you only get up to like, I don't know, 47 or something like that. In this case, drug X has higher efficacy than drug Y, okay? So here there is a real difference in how much effect you get out of it. So efficacy is how much response you can get. Potency is the amount of drug it takes to get a response. And these are really two different things. And you really need to understand the distinction between these, okay? In general, in terms of how useful a drug is, efficacy is far more important than potency, actually, right? Say this is the percent you lower blood pressure. You'd rather have a drug that's good at lowering blood pressure than a drug that's good at lowering blood pressure at a lower concentration of the drug. So this is actually the treatment response here, right? Efficacy describes the treatment response. Potency just talks about how much of the drug you have to add to get a certain amount of ligand-target interaction. So efficacy is far more important in prescribing than potency. Make sense? Okay. That is a very quick little message, but if you want to have one take-home message for this whole lecture today, well, definitely know occupancy theory and all the stuff. You want to know like agonists, partial agonists, inverse agonists, all that stuff, but definitely wrap your head around potency and efficacy as we have at the very end of this thing. This is a very important slide, the very last one. So can I say that's a very important slide like 10 times? No, I don't need to do that, right? Okay. And that's it. We'll continue on with this on Wednesday. Thanks. You're welcome.